The day I found out about Delilah and James wasn't a dramatic explosion of truths. It was quieter than that, almost insidious. It was a Saturday, and the family had gathered for one of those routine dinners my mother insisted on hosting. Eleanor loved to put on a show of unity, her pristine house and elaborate meals masking the dysfunction beneath. I remember catching a strange look between Delilah and James as we sat down for dinner. It wasn't the kind of glance you'd expect between in-laws. It lingered too long, carried too much weight. I brushed it off at first. Paranoia, I thought. But then, Delilah's laugh came too easily at his jokes, her hand brushing his arm during a story. Little things started piling up, small enough to be deniable but loud enough to leave a ringing in my ears. After dinner, I stepped out for air. The tension in the room, though unspoken, had left me suffocating. James followed me onto the porch, lighting a cigarette he didn't bother offering me. He was too casual, too confident, his smirk carrying an edge I couldn't place. "You seem tense, Liam," he said, his tone almost mocking. I shrugged it off, muttering something about work. But as I turned back toward the house, I caught sight of Delilah through the window, standing too close to Eleanor, her expression anxious. They stopped talking the moment they noticed me watching, their smiles forced as they waved. That night, after the kids were in bed, I couldn't shake the unease. Delilah was brushing her hair, sitting on the edge of the bed, when I finally asked, "Is there something going on with you and James?" She froze, just for a second. But it was enough. "What?" "That's ridiculous, Liam," she said, her laugh forced and a little too loud. "Where's this coming from?" Her reaction only deepened my suspicion. "I don't know," I said carefully. "It's just, something felt off tonight." She scoffed, brushing me off. "You're imagining things. Maybe you should talk to someone about all this stress you're carrying." Her words stung more than they should have. It wasn't just dismissal, it was a calculated jab. I didn't push further that night, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already taking root. In the days that followed, little inconsistencies started to add up. Late-night texts she claimed were work-related, hushed phone calls in the next room, her sudden eagerness to attend every family gathering when she used to beg to skip them. And James, his smirks grew bolder, his comments more suggestive, his presence around our home too frequent to ignore. The breaking point came a week later. I stumbled upon Delilah's phone on the kitchen counter, a text from James lighting up the screen. "Wish we had more time. Last night was unforgettable." I felt my chest tighten as the world around me went silent. The air seemed heavier, suffocating, as if the walls of the house were closing in. This was no misunderstanding, no overreaction. This was betrayal, plain and undeniable. And I wasn't going to let it go unpunished. The night I confirmed Delilah's affair with James was the longest night of my life. I stayed up in the darkened living room, staring at nothing, replaying every moment of the past few months. Hindsight was cruel. There were signs everywhere, ones I'd dismissed as paranoia or stress. Now they came rushing back, each one hitting me like a hammer. She had been pulling away for months, little things I chalked up to the natural ebb and flow of a marriage. Her growing impatience with the kids, her late nights working, her sudden interest in dressing up for mundane errands. I thought it was a phase, something we'd work through. But now I saw it for what it was: deception. The betrayal was overwhelming, not just because of Delilah but because of James. He wasn't just my brother. He had been my closest link to family growing up. Sure, we were different. He was always the outgoing golden child, while I was quieter, more focused on my work. But I never thought he would cross this line. Family doesn't do this to each other. The next morning, I confronted Delilah in my head 1,000 times, but when the time came, she beat me to it. She was calm, detached even, as if she had rehearsed her role in this mess. She spun the situation as a misunderstanding, calling me paranoid, saying I was imagining things. Her tone was smooth, practiced, designed to gaslight me into doubting myself. I didn't let her see how much it rattled me. I knew the truth now, even if she wouldn't admit it. But her confidence, her sheer audacity, left me stunned. She wasn't apologetic. She wasn't even defensive. She acted as if I was the one tearing the family apart by questioning her. Eleanor, my mother, only made things worse. She called that afternoon, seemingly out of concern, but it quickly became clear she was taking sides. Eleanor was always a master at manipulation, her words coated in just enough sweetness to mask the poison. She urged me to let things go, to focus on the family, to keep the peace. She didn't outright defend Delilah, but her message was clear. I needed to back down for the sake of appearances. Eleanor had always favored James. He was the charming one, the one who could do no wrong in her eyes. I could already see the narrative she was building. If this came out, it wouldn't be their betrayal that tore the family apart, it would be my inability to handle it. I could hear it in her tone, the subtle insinuation that I was unstable, irrational, unfit to handle the situation. Delilah leaned into this narrative with ease. She started to play the role of the concerned wife, carefully planting seeds of doubt about my mental state. She would make comments about how stressed I seemed, how the kids were noticing, how I wasn't myself. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, more deliberate. She began weaponizing the children against me. It was the cruelest blow, one I hadn't expected. She'd make offhand comments around them, painting herself as the victim. She acted like she was holding the family together, like she was the only stable parent they had. The kids were too young to see through it, and that broke me more than anything. I realized I couldn't confront this head-on. They were too good at twisting the story, at making me look like the villain. I needed to step back, to plan, to protect myself and my children. I started documenting everything: the texts, the subtle lies, the manipulative comments. I needed proof, not just for myself but for anyone who might question my side of the story later. At the same time, I began quietly preparing for the worst. I looked into legal options, spoke to a lawyer about custody and financial safeguards. I started moving joint funds into accounts Delilah couldn't touch, ensuring I'd have the resources to fight back if she tried to take everything from me. It felt like a game of chess, every move calculated, every step taken with caution. I had to stay ahead of them, to anticipate their next move. The betrayal was a fire burning in my chest, but I couldn't let it consume me. I had to stay focused for the kids, for myself. The fallout wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a slow, grinding unraveling of everything I thought I knew. Every interaction with Delilah and James was laced with tension. Every word from Eleanor was a calculated maneuver. I was surrounded by betrayal, but I refused to let it break me. I had lost so much in those few days. My trust, my sense of security, my family as I knew it. But I hadn't lost everything. I still had my children, and I would do whatever it took to protect them from the mess their mother and uncle had created. The fallout wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of my fight to take back control of my life. And I was ready. The days following the initial fallout were surreal. I moved through my routines with a strange detachment, as if watching my own life from the outside. Delilah's behavior became more deliberate, more strategic. She was playing the role of the perfect mother and wife in public while subtly driving a wedge between me and the children. At first, it was small things, her telling the kids, "Daddy's really stressed," or "Daddy's just having a hard time right now." Innocent enough on the surface, but designed to plant doubt. Then it escalated. She'd scold me in front of them for being too strict or claim I was overreacting when I asked for simple things like cleaning up after dinner. It wasn't about the actions. It was about the message she wanted to send, that I was losing control. James, on the other hand, stayed out of sight for a while, probably at Eleanor's urging. But his absence didn't make his presence any less felt. Delilah's demeanor was proof enough that they were still in contact, likely strategizing on how to keep me from exposing them. Eleanor's interference became more frequent. She began dropping by unannounced, her visits framed as checking in on the family. But her questions weren't casual. They were pointed, prying into my state of mind, asking if I was coping okay or taking care of myself. It was a thinly veiled attempt to frame me as unstable. I realized I couldn't play their game on their terms. They were too good at manipulation, too practiced in turning the narrative to suit their needs. I had to think several steps ahead, to plan not just for the present but for every possible outcome. First, I secured the financial groundwork. Over the course of several weeks, I quietly transferred money from our joint accounts into an account in my name. It wasn't theft, It was protection. I left enough in the joint account to avoid suspicion, but I made sure I had what I needed to cover legal fees and secure the kids' future if things escalated. Next, I began gathering evidence. Every lie, every manipulative comment, every instance of Delilah's strange behavior, I documented it all. I backed up text messages, took screenshots, and recorded dates and times of incidents. I even installed a small recording device in the car, knowing that most of her more candid remarks came during those moments when she thought no one else could hear. I avoided confrontations. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't afford to lose my temper or give them anything they could use against me. When Delilah baited me with her accusations or passive-aggressive remarks, I stayed calm. When Eleanor pressed me with her thinly veiled concern, I gave her nothing but polite deflections. Behind the scenes, I reached out to a lawyer. I didn't tell anyone, not even Amelia. The lawyer was a quiet, no-nonsense man who didn't waste time sugarcoating the situation. He confirmed what I already suspected, that I was in for a fight if I wanted to protect my children. But he also gave me hope. With the evidence I was collecting and the steps I was taking, I had a solid case. What I didn't expect was how isolating it all would feel. I couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening. Not the kids, not my friends, not even my sister. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what they thought was best for the family, and most of those opinions boiled down to keeping the peace. But keeping the peace wasn't an option anymore. The turning point came when Delilah's lies started to unravel in small but significant ways. One evening, I overheard her on the phone, her tone frantic as she argued with someone, likely James. She didn't notice me listening, but her words were telling. She mentioned the kids, Liam's suspicions, and keeping Eleanor on our side. It was clear they were feeling the pressure, which meant my strategy was working. Around the same time, Amelia began asking questions. She noticed Eleanor's increasing presence and the strained dynamic between Delilah and me. At first, I avoided telling her the truth. Amelia had always been close to Eleanor, and I wasn't sure where her loyalties would lie. But when she confronted me directly, asking if something was wrong, I hesitated. There was a sincerity in her concern that made me want to trust her. Instead of spilling everything, I tested the waters. I hinted at the tension in my marriage, how things weren't as perfect as they seemed. To my surprise, she listened without judgment. More importantly, she didn't run to Eleanor with what I said. It gave me hope that she might eventually be an ally. Through it all, I kept my focus on the kids. They were my anchor, the reason I couldn't let this betrayal destroy me. I made extra time for them, ensuring they felt loved and secure despite the storm brewing around us. Delilah noticed and began trying harder to monopolize their attention, but it didn't matter. The kids knew who they could rely on, and that was enough for now. My response wasn't driven by revenge, though the temptation was there. It was about survival, protecting myself and my children from the fallout of Delilah and James's selfishness. Every step I took was a step toward reclaiming control of my life. The pieces were starting to come together, and I knew it was only a matter of time before their house of cards collapsed. I just needed to be ready for the moment it did. It was Amelia who surprised me the most during this ordeal. My sister had always been the mediator in the family, the one who smoothed over disagreements and kept everyone talking. She had an unshakable belief in the goodness of people, a trait that often left her blind to Eleanor's manipulation and James's self-serving tendencies. But even she couldn't ignore the tension that had taken over our family. She started showing up unannounced, much like Eleanor, but her visits felt different. Amelia wasn't there to probe or lecture. She genuinely wanted to help. At first, I kept her at arm's length, unsure of her motives. After all, Eleanor had a way of pulling Amelia into her schemes without her even realizing it. But Amelia's questions were different. She wasn't looking for ammunition to use against me. She was trying to piece together the fragments of a story she couldn't fully see. She noticed the way Eleanor hovered around Delilah, how they exchanged knowing glances during family gatherings. She noticed how guarded I'd become, how the kids seemed caught in the crossfire of something they didn't understand. One evening, as we sat in the living room while the kids played upstairs, she broke the silence. She said she couldn't ignore the growing rift in the family and wanted to understand what was happening. I could see the concern in her eyes, the genuine frustration at being kept in the dark. I hesitated. Trust wasn't something I could give freely anymore, not even to my own sister. But I knew I couldn't handle this alone forever. Slowly, cautiously, I began to open up. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to let her know there was more going on than a typical marital rough patch. To her credit, Amelia didn't push. She listened, and for once, she didn't try to fix things or defend anyone. It was a small step, but it gave me hope. What solidified her as an ally came a week later, when she stumbled upon something that changed everything. Amelia had always been the type to help Eleanor with errands, sorting through paperwork or organizing family events. During one of these tasks, she found a folder tucked away in Eleanor's study, a collection of documents and emails that painted a damning picture. It wasn't just about the affair. It was evidence of Eleanor's deeper involvement, her efforts to manipulate the situation and protect James and Delilah at all costs. There were notes about conversations she'd had with Delilah, advice on how to handle me, and even plans to frame me as unstable if things escalated. Amelia brought the folder to me that same evening, her hands shaking as she handed it over. She was horrified, not just by the betrayal itself but by Eleanor's cold, calculated approach. She apologized repeatedly for not seeing the truth sooner, for ever doubting me. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Amelia wasn't just a passive observer, she was ready to take action. With her help, I began piecing together the full scope of their schemes. Amelia provided insight into Eleanor's patterns, how she used guilt and manipulation to control people. She even started asking subtle questions during family gatherings, gathering more information without raising suspicion. Having Amelia on my side was a turning point. She was a connection to the family I had felt isolated from, a reminder that not everyone had turned against me. More importantly, she was someone Delilah and Eleanor underestimated. They saw her as naive, easily swayed, which made her the perfect person to gather information and disrupt their plans. Together, we started building a stronger case. Amelia's discovery of Eleanor's documents added weight to the evidence I had been collecting. It wasn't just about proving the affair anymore. It was about exposing the entire web of deceit they had spun around me and the kids. But it wasn't just about evidence. Amelia helped me see things I had been too angry or hurt to notice. She reminded me that the kids were watching, absorbing everything. She encouraged me to keep my focus on them, to be the steady presence they needed in the chaos. Her support gave me the strength to keep going, to push through the moments when the betrayal felt too heavy to bear. She reminded me that this wasn't just about justice, it was about rebuilding a future for myself and the kids, free from the toxic influence of Delilah, James, and Eleanor. As we worked together, I began to feel a shift. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt like I had the upper hand. Their lies were unraveling, their control slipping. And with Amelia by my side, I knew I had a real chance to not just survive this, but to come out stronger. This was no longer just a fight to expose the truth. It was a fight to reclaim my life and protect the people who mattered most. Delilah and Eleanor must have sensed that their grip was loosening, because their tactics became more aggressive. It wasn't enough for them to dismiss my suspicions or paint me as unstable. Now they turned their focus to the children. It was their cruelest move yet, and I'll never forget how calculated it all felt. It started with small things, barely noticeable at first. Delilah would make little comments in front of the kids, subtle digs meant to undermine me. "Daddy's been so distracted lately," she'd say as I helped our son with his homework, or, "Daddy gets upset so easily these days," if I raised my voice during a tense moment. She always said it lightly, like an offhand remark, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Eleanor joined in, weaving her narrative whenever she visited. She'd praise Delilah for being such a strong mother, and talk about how hard it must be for her to keep the family together. Sometimes she'd call the kids over to her and quietly ask if I was treating Mommy nicely. It was subtle, but the seeds were being planted. What hurt the most was how Delilah started using the kids as pawns. She'd schedule special outings with them, ones I wasn't invited to, and make a big show of how much fun they'd had without me. Or she'd pick fights with me in front of them, forcing me to either stay silent or risk looking like the bad guy. I'll never forget the night I overheard her talking to our oldest, quietly trying to explain that sometimes parents don't always get along, and that it wasn't anyone's fault. She made it sound like I was the problem, like I was the one tearing the family apart. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I stopped myself. I knew that was exactly what she wanted, to push me into a reaction that she could twist into a weapon. Instead, I focused on damage control. I started spending even more time with the kids, making sure they felt secure and loved. I planned fun activities for us, weekend hikes, movie nights, trips to the park. I made sure they knew they could always come to me, no matter what. At the same time, I began documenting everything. Every manipulative comment, every interaction designed to alienate the kids from me, I wrote it all down. I even started recording some of our family moments, not just for evidence, but to show the kids one day that I had always been there for them. Amelia helped too. She started visiting more often, spending time with the kids and reinforcing my presence in their lives. She was careful not to criticize Delilah or Eleanor directly, but she made a point of showing them what real support looked like. The kids adored her, and her presence gave me the strength to keep going. But the situation came to a head one night when Delilah crossed a line I hadn't seen coming. Our youngest had been struggling with a school project and asked for my help. I stayed up late with him, walking him through every step, and when he proudly showed it to Delilah the next morning, she smiled and said, "It's so nice that Daddy had time to help for once." It was a simple comment, but it cut me to the core. She was erasing everything I had done, not just that night, but for years as a father. I realized then that her goal wasn't just to undermine me, it was to rewrite the story entirely, to make me invisible in my own children's lives. I knew I couldn't let that happen. That evening, I sat down with the kids and talked to them in the most honest way I could. I didn't tell them about the affair or the betrayal. I refused to put that burden on them. Instead, I told them that no matter what happened, I loved them and would always be there for them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I saw the relief in their eyes, the reassurance they needed. They didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but they knew they could trust me. Meanwhile, I kept building my case. The more Delilah and Eleanor tried to manipulate the kids, the more evidence I collected. I knew it would be a long fight, but I was ready. This wasn't just about exposing their lies anymore. It was about protecting my children from the toxic mess their mother and grandmother were creating. The weight of it all was overwhelming at times, but I held on to one simple truth. The kids deserved better. They deserved a home where they could feel safe and loved, free from manipulation and deceit. And no matter what it took, I was going to give them that. Delilah and Eleanor underestimated me. They thought they could use the kids to break me, to force me into submission. But they didn't realize that my love for those kids was stronger than anything they could throw at me. They were fighting to control the narrative, to paint themselves as the heroes in a story of their own making. But I wasn't playing their game anymore. I was writing my own story, a story where the truth would win, no matter how long it took. The moment I had been preparing for finally came, though not in the way I had expected. My plan was to carefully orchestrate the exposure of Delilah and James's affair and Eleanor's manipulations, ensuring there would be no room for denial. I had collected months of evidence, meticulously organizing every screenshot, email, and recording. I was ready, but it was Delilah who gave me the opening. It happened during another one of Eleanor's family dinners. These gatherings had become unbearable, but I forced myself to attend for the sake of appearances and, more importantly, the kids. Eleanor loved to put on her facade of a united family, even as the cracks grew wider. That evening, Delilah was more smug than usual, her confidence practically radiating off her. James, too, was back to his cocky self, throwing glances my way like he had already won some unspoken battle. And Eleanor, ever the puppet master, kept the atmosphere light, cracking jokes and fawning over James's every word. But something about Delilah's demeanor struck me as off. She was too comfortable, too emboldened. It wasn't until dessert was served that I realized why. Eleanor brought out an elaborate cake, announcing it as a celebration of family. She gave a little speech about the importance of sticking together, about forgiveness and unity. Her words were pointed, laced with subtle jabs at me, though she never said my name. The room was silent except for the clinking of silverware as everyone politely pretended not to notice the tension. Then Delilah chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet as she thanked Eleanor for her unwavering support. She didn't look at me, but the implication was clear. It wasn't just support, it was collusion. I felt the anger rise, but I kept my face neutral. I had learned to bide my time, to let them believe they had the upper hand. And in that moment, I realized they thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. The next morning, I set my plan in motion. I contacted Amelia and asked her to gather a few key family members for a meeting at my house. People who needed to hear the truth. People who would see through Eleanor's manipulations if given the chance. She agreed, hesitant but willing, and within a few days, we had a small but important audience. An aunt, a cousin, and an old family friend who had always been a steady voice of reason. I started by laying out the evidence of Delilah and James's affair. The texts, the recorded conversations, the undeniable proof of their betrayal. I watched as the realization dawned on their faces, the shock and disgust replacing the polite neutrality they had maintained for so long. But I didn't stop there. I showed them Eleanor's role in it all, the emails, the notes, the plans to discredit me. I exposed how she had tried to turn my children against me, how she had prioritized protecting James and Delilah over the well-being of her own grandchildren. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, putting my family's ugliness on full display. But it was also liberating. For the first time, the truth was out in the open, and there was no going back. Amelia, to her credit, didn't shy away from supporting me. She spoke up, adding her own observations and confirming what I had shared. Her voice carried weight, and I could see it swaying those who had been on the fence. When I was done, the room was heavy with silence. No one defended Delilah or James. No one tried to excuse Eleanor's actions. The weight of the evidence was too much. I didn't expect immediate action, but the shift was palpable. Word spread quickly through the family, and the reactions were exactly what I had hoped for. Delilah and James found themselves isolated, their usual allies hesitant to associate with them. Eleanor's influence began to wane as more people questioned her motives and saw her for what she truly was. But the biggest victory came when I used the evidence to take legal action. My lawyer filed for custody of the children, citing Delilah's betrayal and her toxic influence. The recordings and documents I had collected were crucial, painting a clear picture of her unfitness as a parent. It was a long, grueling process, but I was prepared for it. And with Amelia's support, I didn't feel as alone in the fight anymore. Delilah and Eleanor underestimated me. They thought they could control the narrative, twist the truth to suit their needs. But the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they tried to bury it. By the end of it, their carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Delilah's reputation was in shambles, James's smug confidence replaced by silence, and Eleanor, well, even she couldn't manipulate her way out of the hole she had dug. It wasn't just about exposing them. It was about reclaiming my life, my children, and my peace of mind. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. I had taken the first real step toward freedom, and I wasn't stopping until I had secured the future my children and I deserved. The fallout hit them harder than I could have ever anticipated. Once the truth was out, there was no controlling the damage. Delilah, James, and Eleanor had spent so long orchestrating their lies that they hadn't prepared for what would happen when the rug was pulled out from under them. It started with Delilah. She always prided herself on her image, a devoted mother, an attentive wife, someone who could charm her way through any situation. But when the affair became public knowledge, that image shattered. Friends who once flocked to her turned cold, whispers followed her wherever she went, and invitations to social events dried up. Her carefully constructed world of appearances crumbled before her eyes. She tried to spin the narrative, of course. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was telling people I was vindictive, that I was ruining her life out of spite. But the evidence was too strong, too damning. The screenshots of her texts with James, the recorded phone calls, the documentation of her manipulative behavior, there was no escaping it. Her attempts to weaponize the children against me fell apart, too. The court-appointed evaluator saw right through her. The recordings of her undermining me, her erratic behavior, and her blatant lies were impossible to ignore. By the time the custody hearing rolled around, she was on the defensive, scrambling to hold on to even a fraction of control. The judge granted me primary custody of the children. It was the moment I had fought for, the moment I had dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. Watching Delilah's face as the decision was read was surreal. For the first time, she looked powerless. James didn't fare much better. His cocky attitude vanished the moment the affair became public knowledge. His career took a hit, as colleagues and clients began distancing themselves. People whispered about the kind of man who would betray his own brother, and no one wanted to be associated with him. What little reputation he had left unraveled further when evidence of his financial misdeeds came to light. I had uncovered them while gathering information for the custody battle. Evidence of questionable transactions, shady deals, and outright fraud. I handed it all over to the authorities, letting them handle it. He faced legal consequences that went beyond the affair. His name was tarnished, his career was in shambles, and he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his choices. Eleanor, though, was the hardest to bring down. She had spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation, and even in the face of overwhelming evidence, she refused to back down. She continued to spin her web of lies, trying to salvage her reputation and protect James and Delilah. But her influence wasn't as strong as it used to be. The family began to see through her, especially after Amelia spoke out. My sister's voice carried weight, and her willingness to stand by me made others question Eleanor's motives. Eleanor's social circle, once filled with people who admired her, grew smaller and smaller. Her carefully maintained image of the loving matriarch was replaced by one of a woman willing to destroy her own family to protect her favorite son. The final blow came when the financial fraud James was implicated in was traced back to her as well. Eleanor had been pulling strings behind the scenes, using her influence to cover for James's actions. When it all came to light, she was forced to step back from the charities and organizations she had once controlled, her reputation in tatters. Through it all, I stayed focused on my children. They were my anchor, the reason I fought so hard to expose the truth. I made sure they felt safe and loved, shielding them as much as I could from the chaos. There were moments when it felt overwhelming, when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. But I reminded myself of what was at stake. This wasn't just about justice, it was about creating a life free from the toxic influence of Delilah, James, and Eleanor. In the end, the legal and social consequences they faced weren't just about punishing them. They were about taking back control, about reclaiming the parts of my life they had tried to steal from me. The fight had been exhausting, but it was worth it. For the first time in years, I could see a future that wasn't overshadowed by their lies and manipulations. A future where my children could grow up in a home filled with love and honesty, not deceit and betrayal. It wasn't just a victory, it was a new beginning. It's been 5 years since that chapter of my life closed, and though the scars remain, they no longer define me. The chaos that Delilah, James, and Eleanor brought into my world feels like a distant memory now, a storm I weathered to reach calmer waters. The children and I have built something I can only describe as peaceful. The first year was the hardest, adjusting to the new normal, reassuring the kids that they were safe, and helping them process the fractures in their family. Therapy played a big role for all of us. It gave them the tools to navigate their emotions and help me figure out how to parent without the shadow of bitterness clouding every decision. They still see Delilah, though it's supervised visits for now. I made the decision to allow her that connection because, despite everything, I didn't want the kids to feel like they had lost their mother entirely. She tries, I'll give her that, but the kids have grown distant from her in ways that even I can't fully control. They're old enough now to recognize the cracks in her stories, the inconsistencies in how she presents herself. James is no longer part of their lives. I don't think he wants to be, and frankly, I prefer it that way. The damage he caused left a mark, but he's irrelevant now, a ghost of the past that no longer holds any power over me or my children. As for Eleanor, she's faded into obscurity. The fallout from her manipulations left her reputation in ruins, and she spends most of her time alone now. I hear about her occasionally through family members, but I've kept my distance. She tried to reach out once, a carefully written letter full of half-hearted apologies and thinly veiled attempts at absolution. I didn't respond. Amelia and I have grown closer than ever. She stayed by my side through the hardest moments, and her loyalty never wavered. She's more than my sister now. She's my confidant, someone I can rely on no matter what. She's even taken on a kind of aunt role with the kids, stepping in to help whenever I need it. I owe her more than I could ever repay. For myself, life has taken a quieter, steadier path. I left the house that held too many painful memories and moved to a smaller town where the kids and I could start fresh. I'm still teaching, though I've added some administrative work to my schedule. It's fulfilling, and it gives me the stability I need to focus on what really matters. The kids are thriving. My oldest is in high school now, full of ambition and curiosity, while my youngest has developed a love for sports I never saw coming. They're growing into kind, thoughtful people, and I couldn't be prouder. There are moments, of course, when the past creeps in. A smell, a song, or a fleeting memory can bring it all rushing back. But those moments don't linger like they used to. I let them come and then let them go, knowing they're just echoes of something I've left behind. I've even started to think about opening my heart again. For years, I couldn't imagine trusting anyone the way I had trusted Delilah. But time has a way of softening even the deepest wounds. I've met someone, a colleague at the school, who makes me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. It's slow, tentative, but it feels right. If there's one thing this entire ordeal taught me, it's the value of resilience. I was pushed to the edge, betrayed by the people I should have been able to trust the most. But I didn't let it break me. I fought back, not just for myself but for my children, and in doing so, I discovered a strength I didn't know I had. Looking back, I don't regret the steps I took. They were harsh, yes, but they were necessary. Delilah, James, and Eleanor had created a world of lies and manipulation, one that could have destroyed me if I'd let it. Instead, I dismantled it piece by piece, exposing the truth and reclaiming my life. The life I have now isn't perfect, but it's mine. It's honest, it's peaceful, and it's filled with love. The kids and I have created something stronger than what we lost. A home built on trust, respect, and the understanding that we'll always have each other. I don't think I'll ever fully forgive them for what they did. But forgiveness isn't the goal anymore. Moving on is. And I've done that. We've done that. We're free now, and that freedom is worth everything I endured to get here.